The neighborhood sold itself on appearances long before anyone ever cared about community, with perfectly trimmed hedges framing every sidewalk like a showroom display, pavement always clean, mailboxes identical, and lawns measured not in grass but in compliance. And at the center of it all sat the pool, a shimmering blue rectangle that wasn't just a place to swim but a symbol representing status, control, and the illusion of shared privilege. The kind of amenity that looked inclusive on brochures but exclusive in practice, layered with rules upon rules, policies printed in fine text, and enforcement that shifted depending on who was watching, remaining calm and regulated for years until one summer afternoon quietly reset the balance. I had lived there long enough to understand the unspoken hierarchy, where board members weren't just volunteers but self-appointed gatekeepers who didn't enforce rules equally but strategically, where certain driveways were never ticketed, certain lawns never measured, and certain people moved freely while others were constantly reminded of where they stood. And I stayed out of it by paying my dues, following the rules, and minding my business. An approach that worked until friends came to visit and the pool stopped being about water. It was supposed to be a simple weekend with friends from out of town who had known me long before HOA bylaws and parking restrictions. The heat brutal and heavy. The pool making sense because it was there, empty, paid for, nothing extravagant or disruptive, just people cooling off on a day that demanded it, with no signs, notices, or warnings posted, at least not to me. Then came the first look, not a word or announcement, just the presence of someone who believed the pool belonged to them more than it ever could belong to anyone else. Approaching not like a neighbor but like an auditor, posture calibrated, scanning faces, counting people, assessing what didn't match her internal list of approved residents. And in that moment, everything shifted. Rules suddenly mattered as guest limits, access hours, and registration procedures no one had mentioned before became urgent. The pool turning into a controlled checkpoint with required wristbands, demanded names, mandatory verification, and my friends, invited guests of a dues-paying homeowner, treated as intruders. The situation escalating not through confrontation but procedure. No raised voices or scenes, just selective authority applied until compliance was inevitable. The pool was cleared efficiently, a denial wrapped in bureaucracy, made worse by the performance of enforcement that appeared only when it benefited one person's sense of dominance, ignoring how the same pool had hosted parties and unregistered gatherings before without consequence, how discretion had always existed until it didn't. I didn't argue or protest because resistance in that neighborhood didn't happen at the gate, but later on paper through loopholes and technicalities. The board never expected residents to understand. And though the afternoon ended quietly, something fundamental had changed, because the pool revealed the real structure of the place. And once you see that, it's impossible to unsee. Over the next few days, enforcement intensified as notices appeared. Policies were highlighted and underlined with obsessive enthusiasm. Access became conditional, approval personal, every obstacle pointing toward inconvenience and compliance through exhaustion. That was when I started reading deliberately, knowing HOA documents were long, dense, and designed to discourage scrutiny. Yet buried within them were permissions, exceptions, and old clauses, and one section stood out, not about pools or guests, but about water. The community was built near an older drainage system predating the HOA, with easements allowing property owners to redirect runoff under specific conditions, something most residents didn't know and the board didn't advertise. But the language was unmistakable, placing water flow under county regulations rather than HOA jurisdiction, with clear definitions of legal redirection. The realization sparked clarity rather than anger because the pool wasn't the real issue, control was, and control only worked when everyone believed the rules were one-sided. A belief that ended when I understood the same system used to restrict could also be used to respond. I didn't act immediately because timing and perception mattered, and everything needed to look clean, reasonable, and compliant. No emotion or retaliation, just action fitting neatly inside the framework no one questioned, while the board focused on access lists and guest policies, and I focused on logistics, capacity, volume, and what could move legally, invisibly, and effectively. A water truck wasn't a weapon, but a common, regulated service used daily for construction and maintenance, raising no alarms because no rules prohibited it and no clauses restricted it, just water following gravity rather than authority. By the time the truck was scheduled, the driveway across the street gleamed like a showroom with polished concrete, and a luxury SUV parked perfectly within painted lines. Everything pristine and ready. Because the pool had been locked to prove a point, but concrete remembers water longer than people remember rules. And once the flow started, there would be no shouting, confrontation, or accusation to undo what gravity would do naturally. And as the truck's engine echoed faintly through the neighborhood unnoticed by most, the story quietly moved from restriction to consequence, and the next chapter wouldn't be about rules anymore, but about overflow. By the time the decision settled fully in my mind, it no longer felt like retaliation but like alignment, as if events were simply correcting themselves along paths that had always existed but rarely been followed. The neighborhood continued its routine, blissfully unaware that anything had changed beneath the surface. Lawns were watered at approved hours, trash bins were aligned just so, and the pool gate clicked open and shut under its new regime of selective enforcement. From the outside, nothing appeared different. Internally, however, the structure had already shifted. I spent days reviewing documents most residents had never touched, tracing references backward through amendments and appendices, discovering how often authority depended less on power and more on assumption. The HOA thrived on the belief that it governed everything within visible boundaries, yet its reach ended where older agreements began. Long before identical mailboxes and uniform fences, the land had been shaped to manage water, not people, and those channels still existed, quiet and unchallenged, waiting beneath decorative landscaping and decorative authority alike. The more I read, the clearer it became that enforcement relied on ignorance, and ignorance was not something I could unlearn. I mapped the property lines not as they were marketed, but as they were recorded. I noted slopes, runoff paths, the way rain already behaved during storms. Water never respected the HOA's preferences. It followed physics. That truth had simply never mattered before because no one had needed it to. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the neighborhood grew tighter, not louder but sharper, like air before a storm. Notices appeared on doors reminding residents of compliance standards that had always existed but were suddenly urgent. The pool gate now bore laminated warnings, carefully worded to sound neutral while clearly aimed. The same person who had first assessed my guests now seemed omnipresent, appearing at meetings, pacing common areas, her presence alone enough to signal that scrutiny was active. There was no confrontation, no accusations directed at me directly, which made it all more effective. Pressure without conflict was the HOA's favorite tool. It left no evidence of wrongdoing, only discomfort. Friends noticed it even without explanation. The way movement through shared spaces suddenly felt conditional. Invitations declined. Visits shortened. The restriction had achieved its goal without ever being declared. That was the moment I understood how control truly functioned here and why it had never been challenged successfully. People resisted emotionally, verbally, impulsively, and those responses were easy to neutralize. What no one expected was compliance weaponized through patience. The water truck reservation went through without issue. The company treated it like any other request because it was. There were forms, permits, confirmation numbers, all perfectly legitimate. No HOA approval was required because the service did not alter structures or violate noise ordinances. It was temporary, mobile, and invisible until it was. The timing mattered. It had to look ordinary, unremarkable, almost accidental. Early afternoon, when most residents were either away or distracted, when oversight relaxed. I reviewed county guidelines again, double-checking flow limits, ensuring every parameter was respected. The goal was never destruction. It was demonstration. Water, when used improperly, causes chaos. When used legally, it causes inevitability. The day arrived quietly. The truck rolled in like any other service vehicle, blending into the background of landscapers and maintenance crews that circulated regularly. No one questioned it. No one stopped it. The driver followed instructions precisely, positioning along the natural grade that sloped subtly but decisively toward the neighboring driveway. It was a slope no one ever noticed because it had never mattered, a design feature hidden beneath aesthetics. As the tank began to release its load, the water didn't rush or surge. It spread, slowly, methodically, filling channels that already existed, channels designed decades earlier to carry excess runoff during heavy rain. This was not excess. This was controlled volume, released at a rate that mirrored nature closely enough to avoid suspicion. The driveway accepted it at first, concrete darkening, seams filling, nothing dramatic. Anyone glancing over would have assumed a sprinkler malfunction or brief overspray. But water accumulates memory. It doesn't forget direction. As minutes passed, the pooling became noticeable. The slight lip at the driveway's edge, installed to prevent debris, now served as a barrier, holding water where it wasn't meant to linger. The SUV sat perfectly still, its tires gradually surrounded, reflections shimmering beneath polished paint. There was no alarm, yet no reaction. The house remained closed, blinds drawn, air conditioning humming inside, unaware of what gravity was accomplishing outside. The beauty of the situation lay in its silence. No one needed to announce anything. No one needed to explain. The HOA's entire system depended on observation and reaction, and this event offered neither immediately. When attention finally came, it arrived confused rather than confrontational. Neighbors noticed water where water shouldn't be, but couldn't identify a violation. There were no hoses running illegally, no sprinklers outside approved times, just water sitting where it had flowed naturally. The board member's driveway was not exempt from physics, even if she believed it was exempt from inconvenience. By the time concern escalated to awareness, the water had already done its work. It had seeped into places concrete pretended didn't exist, settled into seams, collected beneath weight. It hadn't damaged anything yet, but it had created urgency, and urgency was something the HOA usually controlled. Now it belonged to the environment. When the water truck completed its task and left, the neighborhood returned to stillness, but the driveway did not dry quickly. Shade and slope worked together to preserve the result. By the time doors opened and the situation was finally seen clearly, there would be no simple explanation, no rule to cite, no immediate authority to invoke. Only the realization that control, once exercised without restraint, had invited consequences that followed a different jurisdiction entirely. And as attention finally turned outward, searching for responsibility, the question that lingered wasn't who had caused it, but how something so ordinary could feel so deeply unsettling, setting the stage for a response that would only deepen the divide in the chapter to come. By the time the water was fully noticed, the narrative had already begun to fracture, and what made the moment so powerful was not the presence of damage, but the absence of an obvious culprit. The driveway glistened under the sun long after the truck had gone, the pooled water refusing to evaporate quickly, clinging stubbornly to the shallow depressions that no one had ever considered flaws until they became inconvenient. From a distance, it looked like the aftermath of an unexpected storm, except the sky was clear and the forecast unforgivingly dry. That contradiction alone unsettled the order of the neighborhood, a place that relied on predictability as a form of security. The first reactions were quiet and instinctive, the kind that happen before authority can assemble itself. Doors opened more slowly. Windows shifted. People paused longer on their walks, glancing toward the driveway and then away, as if looking too long might invite participation in something unapproved. The SUV sat unmoved, its tires partially submerged, its immaculate finish reflecting sunlight in a way that drew the eye even when no one wanted to stare. It was the kind of vehicle that symbolized status here, not just transportation, but proof of compliance rewarded. Seeing it surrounded by water introduced a subtle but powerful discomfort, the suggestion that privilege might not be immune to circumstance. The house remained closed for longer than expected, and in that delay, speculation bloomed. When awareness finally reached its owner, it did not arrive as outrage but as confusion, the kind that precedes anger when assumptions fail. The HOA had mechanisms for violation, for punishment, for enforcement, but it had no script for this. There was no obvious rule broken, no visible equipment running, no person standing nearby to confront. The water simply existed, and existence alone was not punishable. That gap in authority was where everything began to unravel. Attention shifted outward, searching for explanation, and as it did, the familiar tools of control were deployed out of habit rather than strategy. Notices were drafted hastily. Maintenance was contacted. Questions were asked that assumed answers would align with expectation. But each inquiry ran into the same problem. The source of the water was neither illegal nor active. It had already moved on. The drainage channels, once invisible, now became objects of scrutiny, and in that scrutiny, older realities surfaced. Easements were mentioned, then quickly dismissed, then mentioned again when dismissal failed to resolve anything. The board member's urgency contrasted sharply with the system's inertia. She was used to being the mechanism, not waiting for it. The longer the water lingered, the more visible the limitation of her authority became, and visibility was dangerous in a community built on perceived control. Neighbors began to talk quietly, not loudly enough to be confrontational, but enough to circulate doubt. Questions surfaced that had never been voiced before about selective enforcement, about consistency, about how rules seemed to appear and disappear depending on who benefited. The driveway became more than a driveway. It became a reference point. People compared it to their own experiences, moments when rules had been applied suddenly and without warning, times they had complied because resistance felt futile. Watching inconvenience touch someone usually insulated from it disrupted that resignation. It suggested that the system was not as absolute as it pretended to be. Efforts to resolve the situation grew more frantic but less effective. Pumps were considered, then rejected due to liability. Redirecting the water risked violating the same regulations the HOA loved to cite. Waiting for evaporation became the default, an uncharacteristically passive approach that frustrated everyone involved. Meanwhile, the SUV remained trapped in place, not damaged but immobilized, a daily reminder that authority did not guarantee immunity. Each passing hour stretched the tension further, drawing more attention, eroding the quiet compliance that sustained the neighborhood's order. What made the situation unbearable was not the water itself, but the uncertainty surrounding it. No one could confidently say who was responsible, which meant no one could confidently punish anyone else. That vacuum of accountability unsettled the board more than any open rebellion ever could. Attempts to reassert control shifted toward indirect pressure. Policies unrelated to water were suddenly enforced with renewed vigor elsewhere, as if tightening the net in other areas might compensate for the loss here. But that strategy only highlighted the imbalance further. Residents noticed the contrast between aggressive enforcement in safe targets and cautious hesitation around the flooded driveway. The message was unintentional but clear. Power had boundaries, and those boundaries were being tested. As days passed, the water slowly receded, but the impression it left did not. Concrete dried, but memory did not. The incident became a silent story passed between neighbors, retold in fragments, each version emphasizing a different aspect of the disruption. Some focused on the inconvenience, others on the irony. A few on the realization that compliance was not the only path available. Through it all, the pool remained locked to certain guests, its rules unchanged, but its authority weakened. The connection between the two events was never stated aloud, yet everyone felt it. Control had been challenged without confrontation, consequence delivered without accusation. That realization unsettled the board deeply, because it revealed a vulnerability they could neither regulate nor publicly acknowledge. As normal routines resumed on the surface, the neighborhood carried an undercurrent of anticipation, a sense that something had shifted permanently, that the rules had been bent in a way that could not be unbent. The stage was set for escalation, not through louder conflict but through sharper scrutiny, as the HOA prepared to respond in the only way it knew how, setting in motion actions that would only expose its fragility further in the chapter ahead. The HOA did not respond to embarrassment with reflection, it responded with expansion. And that expansion arrived disguised as diligence rather than desperation. In the days following the driveway incident, enforcement spread outward like a tightening circle, touching areas that had long been ignored, reinterpreting clauses that had gathered dust, reminding residents through carefully worded notices that compliance was not optional. What made the shift unsettling was not the rules themselves, but the timing. The coincidence was too precise, the reaction too immediate to be mistaken for routine governance. Control, once questioned, was being reasserted everywhere it felt safe to do so. Lawns were measured to fractions of an inch, paint colors scrutinized under different light, trash placement monitored with renewed obsession. It was authority compensating for a moment of weakness by applying pressure where it expected obedience. The irony was that this strategy only amplified the underlying tension. Residents who had quietly observed the flooded driveway now felt the ripple reach their own properties, transforming passive curiosity into personal investment. The neighborhood grew quieter, not because conflict had subsided, but because it had gone subterranean. Conversations shifted indoors. Complaints were no longer filed individually, but shared collectively in whispers, texts, and late-night exchanges that built a narrative the board could not monitor. The pool remained a symbol of exclusion, its rules unchanged, its selective enforcement increasingly obvious in contrast to the indiscriminate crackdown elsewhere. That contrast was what eroded trust most effectively. Authority thrives on consistency, and inconsistency invites scrutiny. Every citation issued away from the driveway highlighted the hesitation surrounding it, making the absence of punishment more conspicuous than any fine ever could. The board member at the center of it all appeared more frequently, her presence no longer confident but restless, as if proximity alone could restore the balance that had slipped away. Meetings grew longer and less productive, filled with procedural language that avoided addressing the obvious. No one mentioned the water directly, but every discussion orbited it, circling the unspoken acknowledgement that the HOA had encountered something it could not easily discipline. Legal consultations were rumored, though never confirmed, and that uncertainty only deepened the unease. Residents understood what that meant: money, dues, escalation. The cost of control, once abstract, was becoming tangible. I remained quiet, not out of fear, but out of precision. Visibility was unnecessary now. The system was straining under its own reaction, and intervention would only distract from that process. Instead, I observed how authority behaves when challenged indirectly. It doesn't adapt, it doubles down. That doubling down revealed fault lines. Long-standing grievances resurfaced, not loudly but persistently, as residents compared notes and realized how often rules had been bent for some and rigidly enforced for others. The driveway incident had given them a reference point, a moment where the system faltered publicly, and that memory sharpened every subsequent interaction. Enforcement letters that once intimidated now irritated. Compliance that once felt automatic now felt coerced. The pool, still locked behind its selective barriers, became less of a privilege and more of an emblem of imbalance. Parents questioned why certain families hosted gatherings without scrutiny while others couldn't bring guests without documentation. The answers, when offered, sounded rehearsed and unconvincing. Each explanation contradicted the last, eroding credibility further. The HOA's attempt to regain control through volume created noise, and noise attracted attention. County officials were contacted regarding unrelated matters, inquiries framed as requests for clarification rather than complaints, but each one chipped away at the HOA's claim of comprehensive authority. The realization spread that the board governed only within limits most people had never tested. That knowledge was contagious. The board sensed it too. Their communications grew defensive, heavy with legal language and reminders of consequences. Yet threats require belief to function, and belief was slipping. The neighborhood began to recognize that compliance had been maintained not through fairness but through fatigue. Once that fatigue was replaced by understanding, the dynamic changed irreversibly. The flooded driveway had dried, but its impact lingered as a lesson written into collective memory. It demonstrated that the system could be navigated, that rules were not monolithic, that authority could be redirected just as water had been. The board's response, instead of restoring order, confirmed that vulnerability. As tension simmered, the stage was set for a more direct confrontation, not through spectacle but through exposure, as the costs of control accumulated and the HOA prepared to push harder, unaware that each escalation only made the inevitable reckoning more visible in the chapter yet to come. By the 5th week after the driveway incident, the neighborhood had entered a phase that felt less like governance and more like surveillance, an environment where ordinary routines carried an undercurrent of suspicion, and where every action seemed measured against an invisible ledger. The HOA's intensified enforcement no longer felt strategic. It felt reactive, as though the board was chasing a sense of control that kept slipping just out of reach. Citations arrived with unprecedented frequency, sometimes contradicting one another, sometimes referencing clauses residents had never seen applied before. What made this wave different was not its severity, but its indiscrimination. Even those who had once benefited from leniency found themselves targeted, and that shift fractured the informal alliances that had sustained the board's authority for years. The privileged quieted, realizing immunity was no longer guaranteed, while the routinely scrutinized grew bolder, recognizing that fear had lost its edge. The pool remained a focal point of resentment, not because of the water itself, but because of what it represented. Access granted or denied based on arbitrary judgment rather than clear policy. Parents documented enforcement inconsistencies, dates, times, faces, building records quietly without coordination yet somehow in sync. The sense of isolation the HOA relied on was dissolving, replaced by a collective awareness that individual compliance had been weaponized against community cohesion. The board responded to this shift with formalism, issuing updates that read like legal briefs rather than neighborhood communication. Each message emphasized authority, consequence, and process, but conspicuously avoided acknowledging the growing distrust. That avoidance only amplified it. Rumors circulated of special meetings held without notice, of consultations that cost more than anyone wanted to admit. Dues discussions surfaced again, framed as routine budgeting but widely understood as preparation for something larger. The cost of control was rising, and residents knew who would ultimately pay it. I watched this unfold without intervention, aware that visibility now would undermine the very dynamic exposing itself. The water incident had done its work by existing. Further action was unnecessary. The system was destabilizing itself. What surprised even me was how quickly perception shifted. Acts that would have been dismissed as overreaction weeks earlier were now interpreted as proof of systemic imbalance. A single citation could spark a dozen quiet comparisons, each one reinforcing the same conclusion. Enforcement was no longer about rules, it was about authority reasserting itself through pressure. The board member whose driveway had flooded became increasingly isolated, her presence no longer commanding compliance but provoking discomfort. She attended fewer public gatherings, appeared more guarded, and when she did engage, her authority felt performative rather than assured. The SUV, once a symbol of status, had become a reminder of vulnerability, its memory resurfacing whenever enforcement felt arbitrary. Neighbors began to question the legitimacy of decisions they had previously accepted without hesitation. The HOA's processes, once opaque but trusted, now appeared inconsistent and self-serving. That erosion of trust was more damaging than any legal challenge could have been, because it dismantled the social contract that made enforcement efficient. Without that contract, every rule required justification, every demand invited scrutiny. The board attempted to restore cohesion by invoking community values, but those appeals rang hollow when paired with punitive action. Values cannot be enforced, they must be demonstrated. The pool's restrictions, unchanged despite mounting criticism, stood in stark contrast to the board's rhetoric of fairness. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. Residents began attending meetings not to listen but to observe, to note body language, deflections, and omissions. Silence became a form of resistance, a refusal to validate explanations that no longer aligned with lived experience. The HOA sensed the shift and responded by tightening procedural control, limiting discussion time, redirecting questions, reinforcing hierarchy. That strategy might have worked in a different context, but here it only confirmed what many already believed. That authority was being protected rather than exercised responsibly. The neighborhood existed in a state of suspended anticipation, aware that the pressure could not increase indefinitely without consequence. Something would have to give, either through reform or confrontation. The board seemed to be betting on endurance, assuming fatigue would eventually restore compliance. What it failed to recognize was that fatigue had already been replaced by resolve. Residents were no longer tired, they were attentive. And attention, once focused, does not drift easily. As the HOA prepared to escalate further, drafting measures that would test the limits of its authority, the groundwork for a more explicit challenge was already in place, setting the stage for exposure rather than defiance, and making the next chapter not about reaction, but about revelation. By the time the HOA's pressure campaign reached what it believed was peak intensity, something far more dangerous than anger had begun spreading through the neighborhood: documentation. The board had always relied on residents reacting emotionally, complaining privately, venting online, then eventually returning to compliance when life got busy. But this time, the backlash wasn't loud, it was methodical. The same people who once tossed violation letters into drawers were now photographing envelopes before opening them, saving screenshots of HOA emails, and comparing timestamps with security camera footage and phone location data. The neighborhood had quietly transitioned from a group of isolated homeowners into an informal archive, a living record of inconsistency that the board could not intimidate away. What made the shift so threatening was that it didn't require confrontation. A resident didn't need to argue with a board member at the pool gate to challenge authority. All they had to do was collect enough evidence that the pattern became undeniable. Even those who disliked conflict began to participate, not because they wanted a fight, but because the HOA's behavior had become so erratic that ignoring it felt riskier than noting it. The board's enforcement had evolved into something that resembled panic disguised as professionalism. Citations arrived with vague language that referenced compliance standards without clearly describing violations. Deadlines shortened. Penalties increased. Final notices appeared more often than first warnings ever had. And yet the more aggressive the letters became, the less credible they felt, because residents could now point to instances where the same standard had been ignored when applied to the board's inner circle. This growing awareness created a strange new atmosphere. The HOA's messages still sounded threatening, but the fear they once generated had been replaced by curiosity, and curiosity is the one emotion authority struggles to suppress. People started checking the bylaws not because they suddenly loved reading legal text, but because they wanted to know exactly where the board's power began and ended. That question, once asked sincerely, cannot be unasked. It changes everything. It turns rule followers into investigators and transforms ordinary neighborhood features, fences, sidewalks, pool gates, drainage grates, into jurisdictional boundaries. And in that environment, the old drainage easements that had made the driveway incident possible began to matter again, not as a rumor, but as a reference point. Residents didn't say the word flood out loud often, but the memory of it sat in the background like a silent witness, reminding everyone that the HOA had already encountered something it could not punish. That memory undermined every future threat the board issued. The board tried to counter this erosion by tightening its internal structure, creating committees, announcing reviews, adopting updated procedures that sounded impressive but offered no real transparency. It began scheduling meetings at inconvenient times and limiting the number of questions allowed, framing it as efficiency. It pushed for rule amendments with rushed voting windows, framing it as necessary modernization. But these tactics only confirmed what the neighborhood was beginning to understand. The HOA wasn't restoring order, it was fortifying itself. That distinction mattered. When governance becomes self-preservation, residents stop seeing it as a service and start seeing it as a threat. The pool, still operating as a controlled symbol, became the most visible evidence of this. Restrictions that had once been lightly enforced were now treated like border security. Guest access, which should have been a straightforward privilege of paying dues, was transformed into a discretionary favor that could be granted or denied depending on who was asking and who was watching. The same faces appeared at the gate repeatedly, the same posture of assessment, the same energy of inspection. But what the board didn't realize was that residents had begun tracking that too. Not for drama, not for revenge, but for pattern. Dates were logged. The number of guests at certain gatherings was noted. The absence of enforcement at those gatherings was recorded. The enforcement that appeared only when specific residents used the pool was recorded as well. The HOA's entire structure depended on plausible deniability, on the idea that any action could be justified individually. But when actions are stacked side by side, deniability collapses. In the middle of this shift, something happened that the board did not anticipate. County involvement began to appear not as a threat from residents, but as a necessity created by the HOA's own overreach. It started with small things. A resident questioned whether the HOA had the right to demand removal of a tree that was clearly within a private property boundary. Another asked about the legality of restricting access to a community amenity paid for through dues without a consistent enforcement standard. Someone inquired about whether the HOA's fines had been properly disclosed and whether the escalation schedule complied with state HOA regulations. These weren't dramatic accusations. They were requests for clarification. That made them powerful because they forced outside entities to respond in writing. The HOA had always operated like a closed system, where rules were interpreted internally and consequences were applied without independent oversight. Written clarification from county offices was the opposite of that. It introduced external language into the HOA's narrative, language that did not bend to personality or influence. The board attempted to contain the damage by portraying these inquiries as hostile attacks from disgruntled residents, but the residents weren't acting disgruntled anymore. They were acting informed. That difference made the board's defensive tone feel inappropriate, almost incriminating. As the weeks progressed, the board's messaging grew increasingly contradictory. One letter would emphasize strict adherence to bylaws, while another would mention board discretion as a guiding principle. One email would claim fairness and uniformity, while another would quietly grant exceptions to specific households. This inconsistency wasn't just frustrating, it became evidence. Residents began to understand that the HOA's greatest weakness wasn't a lawsuit or a protest, but the fact that it could not maintain a single coherent standard under scrutiny, and scrutiny had arrived. The board member whose driveway had flooded, the one who had ignited the pool conflict with her selective enforcement, now seemed less like a leader and more like a liability. Her name wasn't always spoken, but her influence was visible in the board's choices, in the tone of enforcement letters, in the obsession with guest restrictions, in the escalation of small violations into major threats. She had built her authority on intimidation, but intimidation fails when people stop being afraid. The neighborhood's energy shifted from whispered complaints to quiet preparation. People printed documents, they organized folders, they shared links to state HOA statutes. They reviewed meeting minutes and noticed discrepancies, missing votes, unexplained expenses. And then a particular detail surfaced that changed the temperature instantly. A line item in the HOA's budget that didn't match prior years, categorized vaguely under legal consultation and enforcement administration. Large enough to be noticed, yet explained in no meeting. It wasn't proof of wrongdoing by itself, but it suggested urgency, and it suggested that the HOA knew something was coming. Residents didn't need to guess what that something was. The board was preparing for conflict not because residents had attacked, but because the board had pushed so far that conflict had become inevitable. The neighborhood was no longer simply living under rules. It was watching a system tighten around itself like a knot. And knots, when pulled too tight, don't become stronger. They snap. As the next meeting approached, an emergency session announced with minimal notice and maximum formality. The community understood that the board would attempt something decisive, something designed to reestablish dominance quickly. The question was not whether the HOA would escalate, but whether it would make the mistake of escalating on record, creating a paper trail so clear that even its usual protections could not hide behind procedure anymore, setting the stage for a turning point in the chapter ahead where the real battle wouldn't be fought at the pool gate or on a driveway, but in the undeniable weight of written proof. The emergency session arrived wrapped in the language of urgency and necessity, announced with just enough notice to satisfy procedural requirements while still limiting who could reasonably attend. A familiar tactic meant to preserve control under the appearance of transparency. Yet despite the timing, the room filled more than the board anticipated, not with loud opposition or visible anger, but with a quiet, deliberate presence that altered the atmosphere before a single agenda item was addressed. People arrived carrying folders, tablets, printed emails, annotated bylaws, and highlighted statutes, their preparation subtle but unmistakable. This was no longer a gathering of residents hoping to be heard. It was a room of individuals ready to observe, record, and remember. The board members took their seats with practiced formality, projecting authority through posture and process, but something in the dynamic had already shifted. Authority relies on assumption, and assumption weakens when the audience understands the script. The meeting moved forward mechanically at first, approvals granted quickly, prior minutes accepted without discussion, momentum maintained to discourage interruption. But the tension lay beneath the surface, coiled and patient. When the topic of enforcement expansion surfaced, framed as a proactive measure to maintain community standards, the room did not react outwardly. There were no audible objections, no immediate challenges. Instead, pens moved, screens lit up, and notes were taken. Silence, once interpreted by the board as acquiescence, now functioned as scrutiny. The board member whose influence had driven the escalation spoke with confidence, outlining the necessity of stricter controls, emphasizing fairness while avoiding specifics, her words carefully chosen to sound neutral while reinforcing discretionary power. It was a performance she had perfected over years, one that relied on listeners accepting premise without proof. This time the premise did not hold. As the meeting progressed, procedural maneuvers grew more obvious, time limits were introduced mid-discussion, questions were redirected to future correspondence, clarifications were deferred, each deflection meant to preserve order instead highlighted discomfort. The residents noticed. They noted how certain topics were rushed while others lingered. They observed which concerns were acknowledged vaguely and which were bypassed entirely. When documentation was mentioned, logs, comparisons, written inconsistencies, the board responded with generalized assurances rather than engagement, a choice that spoke louder than any admission could have. The room felt suspended, as if everyone understood that something irreversible was approaching, yet no one rushed toward it. That restraint unsettled the board more than confrontation ever could have. Authority can dismiss anger, it struggles against patience. As discussion shifted to budget allocations, the vague line item surfaced again, this time in public view. Explanations were offered in broad terms, referencing standard legal precautions without detailing necessity or scope. The explanation satisfied procedural requirements but failed to satisfy the room. People had already done the math. They had compared years, tracked changes, correlated increases with enforcement spikes. The pattern was too clear to ignore. When the meeting reached its midpoint, the board attempted to close discussion early, citing time constraints and efficiency. That decision, intended to reassert control, became the catalyst instead. Requests to extend discussion were denied politely but firmly, and in that denial the board revealed its fear, not of dissent but of exposure. The residents did not protest the closure. They complied. That compliance, however, was no longer passive. It was strategic. The meeting adjourned with the board maintaining procedural authority, but the victory was hollow. Outside the room, conversations resumed quietly, organized not around emotion but around next steps. The emergency session had accomplished the opposite of its intent. It had placed the board's behavior on record, preserved in notes, recordings, and minutes that would soon be requested and reviewed. It had confirmed that transparency was conditional, that discretion outweighed fairness, that authority was being protected rather than exercised responsibly. Most importantly, it had unified the neighborhood not through outrage, but through understanding. Residents left with clarity. They now knew exactly how far the HOA would go to avoid accountability and exactly how much it feared sustained attention. The pool, the driveway, the enforcement letters, all of it connected now as part of a single narrative. Control maintained through selective pressure and defended through procedural avoidance. The board member at the center of it all appeared visibly strained as the meeting ended, her confidence replaced by vigilance, scanning the room as if expecting confrontation that never came. She did not receive it. What she received instead was something far more destabilizing: collective indifference to intimidation. The neighborhood had stopped reacting and started documenting. That shift transformed every future action into potential evidence. The board could no longer operate casually because every decision would be compared, every inconsistency highlighted. The system that thrived on opacity had been dragged into the light not through rebellion, but through attention. As residents returned to their homes that night, the quiet felt different, heavier with anticipation rather than tension. The emergency session had not resolved anything, but it had clarified everything. The board's next move would have to be decisive because incremental pressure would no longer work. And in that necessity lay risk. The more the HOA attempted to reassert dominance, the more it would expose itself to the very scrutiny it sought to avoid. The stage was no longer set for subtle maneuvering, it was prepared for consequence. And as the pool gate clicked shut once again under its selective rules, it became clear that the next chapter would not revolve around enforcement at all, but around what happens when a system built on control realizes too late that it has documented its own undoing. In the days following the emergency meeting, the HOA's authority no longer moved like a solid structure, but like a story struggling to hold together, each new action forcing it to contradict the last. The board issued a follow-up communication meant to reassure residents, carefully worded to project calm and competence, yet it arrived burdened with the weight of everything it refused to acknowledge. The message spoke of unity, cooperation, and shared values, but conspicuously avoided addressing enforcement inconsistencies, budget irregularities, or the growing concerns surrounding selective access to community amenities. That omission did not go unnoticed. In fact, it became the focal point of attention. Residents compared the language of the message to prior communications, noting how tone shifted depending on circumstance, how accountability was invoked abstractly but never applied concretely. The narrative the HOA had relied on for years, that it governed fairly and uniformly, was no longer accepted at face value. It had to compete with lived experience, and it was losing. Requests for records began arriving, framed politely but persistently, citing statutory rights to transparency. These were not hostile demands but procedural inquiries that forced the board into a defensive posture without ever accusing it directly. Each request carried the same implication. If everything was above board, documentation would confirm it. The board responded slowly, cautiously, releasing information in fragments, redacting where possible, delaying where allowed. Those delays spoke volumes. Residents noticed how quickly enforcement letters were sent compared to how slowly records were produced. The contrast reinforced the perception that authority flowed in one direction, while accountability was obstructed. As documents trickled out, patterns emerged that mirrored what residents had already suspected. Enforcement logs revealed clusters rather than uniform distribution, concentrated on specific households while others appeared untouched. Budget records showed spikes tied closely to periods of increased enforcement activity, suggesting that legal consultation was reactive rather than routine. Meeting minutes, when compared to recordings and personal notes, revealed omissions and softened language that reframed contentious moments as unanimous or uneventful. None of these discrepancies alone proved misconduct, but together they dismantled the credibility of the board's narrative. The HOA attempted to regain control by reframing the situation as a misunderstanding fueled by misinformation, but that explanation rang hollow in the face of tangible records. Misinformation relies on absence of proof, documentation thrives on presence. The board member whose actions had triggered the initial conflict became increasingly isolated within this unraveling story. Her influence, once subtle and effective, now appeared heavy-handed and personal, drawing scrutiny not just to her decisions, but to the structure that enabled them. Residents noticed how often her preferences aligned with enforcement priorities, how consistently her perspective shaped board responses. That alignment, once invisible, now felt glaring. The pool continued to operate under its selective restrictions, but its symbolic power had inverted. Where it once represented privilege and order, it now stood as evidence of imbalance, a visible reminder of how access could be manipulated. Parents began choosing not to use it at all, not out of fear, but out of protest, quiet and coordinated without formal agreement. Empty lounge chairs sent a message no sign ever could. The HOA's attempts to enforce normalcy only highlighted how abnormal the situation had become. County agencies, previously distant, grew more present through correspondence. Clarifications provided in writing contradicted the board's interpretations, not dramatically but decisively, outlining limits on enforcement authority and emphasizing requirements for uniform application of rules. These letters did not accuse, they defined. And definition, when it contradicts practice, forces change. The board faced a choice it had long avoided: adapt or escalate. Adaptation would require admitting error, revising procedures, and relinquishing discretionary power that had been exercised without oversight. Escalation would involve doubling down, risking formal challenges that could expose far more than the board intended. For weeks, it hovered indecisively between those paths, issuing statements that suggested reform while continuing practices that contradicted them. This indecision eroded confidence further. Residents no longer debated whether the HOA was acting fairly. They debated how long it could continue operating as it had. The atmosphere shifted from tension to expectation, the sense that a breaking point was approaching not through confrontation but through inevitability. The board's narrative could not withstand sustained attention because it was built on selective memory rather than consistent record. Each new document, each delayed response, each carefully phrased email added another crack to the facade. The driveway incident, once treated as an anomaly, was now understood as the first visible symptom of a deeper structural flaw, an authority accustomed to obedience, unprepared for examination. As summer waned and the pool's relevance diminished, the conflict did not fade with it. Instead, it matured, shedding emotional heat and gaining procedural weight. Residents understood that the real resolution would not come from dramatic gestures but from formal consequence. The board sensed this too, and its anxiety manifested in increasingly cautious behavior, as if every decision now carried the potential to become evidence. The narrative had collapsed not because of a single act of defiance, but because it could not survive consistency. And as the HOA prepared its next move, aware that its usual strategies no longer worked, the neighborhood stood on the edge of a reckoning that would transform the conflict from an internal dispute into a public record, setting the stage for a final chapter where authority would be forced to confront the limits it had long denied. The turning point didn't arrive with shouting, threats, or a dramatic confrontation at the pool gate, because this story had never been powered by noise. It was powered by certainty, and certainty becomes dangerous when it leaves the neighborhood's private bubble and enters systems that don't care about personalities. After weeks of delays, partial disclosures, and carefully framed HOA statements that tried to keep everything internal, the first undeniable shift came in the form of formal requests that could not be ignored, the kind that automatically created deadlines, tracking numbers, and consequences for noncompliance. Residents who had once felt trapped under vague enforcement letters were now operating inside a different structure entirely, one governed by state HOA regulations, county definitions of jurisdiction, and documentation standards that treated every omission as a potential liability. What made the moment so destabilizing for the board was that it wasn't an attack. It was procedure, and procedure is the one weapon the HOA had always used against others. The board had built its authority by being the gatekeeper of process, by drowning residents in rules and timelines and selective interpretation. Now the board itself was being subjected to that same level of scrutiny, but from agencies and legal frameworks it could not intimidate or conveniently reinterpret. The neighborhood's quiet record-keeping, folders, screenshots, meeting notes, enforcement logs, comparison tables, suddenly mattered in a way it never had before because it wasn't just gossip anymore. It was structured evidence supporting consistent claims of selective enforcement and questionable governance. The HOA's internal narrative, already weakened, began to fail under the weight of external neutrality. County clarifications arrived in writing, outlining what the HOA could and could not control, emphasizing uniform application of rules for shared amenities, and noting that discretionary restrictions tied to personal judgment could create legal exposure. These weren't accusations, they were boundaries. And boundaries, once defined by outside authority, stripped the board of its most powerful tool, ambiguity. The board responded the only way it knew how, through new notices, new language, and a sudden push to appear compliant. Yet the speed of this pivot only confirmed what residents had been saying all along. The HOA had not been enforcing fairly, it had been enforcing strategically. Within days, a revised pool policy appeared, presented as a routine update, but it read like a patch stitched onto a tier, an attempt to retroactively justify behavior that had already been documented. The policy tried to standardize guest access, introduce uniform registration steps, and remove discretionary phrasing that had allowed selective denial. On paper, it looked like improvement. In practice, it looked like panic because the board had not offered an explanation for why these changes were necessary in the first place. The residents didn't need the explanation. They had lived it. The pool, once the stage for the conflict, now became the board's most visible test of credibility. If the new policy was applied uniformly, the HOA would be forced to admit, silently but unmistakably, that the old approach had been unfair. If it was applied selectively again, the new policy would become evidence of deception. Either way, the board was trapped in a logic it could not escape. The board member who had ignited the pool conflict felt this trap more than anyone because her influence had shaped the very behavior now being examined. Her presence around the pool diminished. Her posture shifted. She no longer walked like an inspector. She moved like someone aware that every glance could be interpreted, every intervention recorded. The neighborhood noticed her retreat, and that retreat had consequences of its own. People who once avoided the pool entirely began returning, not to enjoy it, but to observe what uniform enforcement looked like in real time. The simple act of showing up became a form of oversight. The HOA could no longer rely on resident absence to hide inconsistency. Meanwhile, the enforcement campaign elsewhere in the neighborhood softened abruptly. Violations that would have generated fines a month earlier were suddenly met with friendly reminders. Deadlines extended. Threatening language disappeared. The board tried to portray this as compassion, but residents recognized it as risk management. Compassion doesn't arrive after legal clarification. It arrives before harm is done. Risk management arrives when consequences become real. As the HOA attempted to recalibrate, it stumbled repeatedly over its own history. Records requests exposed inconsistencies the board could not explain without admitting selective intent. Budget items tied to legal consultation and enforcement administration raised uncomfortable questions about what advice had been sought and why. Meeting minutes, when compared against recordings and notes residents had gathered, revealed omissions that undermined trust further. The board began to restrict what it put in writing, but that only increased suspicion, because reduced transparency after demands for accountability is never interpreted as innocence. Residents didn't escalate emotionally, they escalated structurally. They filed additional requests. They asked for clear accounting. They requested adherence to open meeting requirements where applicable. They did what the HOA had always expected residents to be too tired or too intimidated to do. The neighborhood's internal dynamics shifted again. Quiet frustration turned into quiet confidence. People realized they were no longer begging for fairness. They were requiring compliance from the governing body that had demanded compliance from them. That inversion was psychologically devastating for a board accustomed to unquestioned authority. The HOA tried to reassert itself with a special vote, an attempt to amend certain bylaws to clarify enforcement discretion, but this effort backfired immediately. Residents arrived prepared not to argue, but to ensure procedure was followed properly and recorded accurately. The attempt to pass ambiguous language in the name of clarity was recognized for what it was, a legal shield disguised as policy improvement. The board could feel the room watching, not emotionally but analytically, and the board's usual tactics, time limits, deferrals, vague answers, no longer worked because every deflection was now interpreted as avoidance with potential legal meaning. The real shock came when a small group of residents, once scattered and uncoordinated, began acting with the quiet discipline of a single entity. They didn't need to announce themselves as a coalition. Their actions already showed it. Consistent requests, consistent framing, consistent reference to statutes, consistent insistence on uniform enforcement. The HOA's power had always depended on fragmentation. Now fragmentation was dissolving into alignment. Even residents who disliked conflict found themselves quietly supportive because the HOA's overreach had crossed a line from inconvenience into systemic imbalance. The board member at the center of the conflict attempted to salvage her authority by reappearing publicly with renewed confidence, but it landed differently now. Her presence no longer signaled control, it signaled risk. People watched her like they watched the water when it pooled in her driveway, curious, attentive, aware that the system's reactions mattered more than the moment itself. And that memory, the driveway incident, returned with renewed force, not as a joke, not as petty revenge, but as a symbol of the HOA's blind spot. The driveway had proven something no resident could forget. The HOA's authority was not absolute, and when its power met the older, larger systems of law and land, it became just another participant, not the ruler. That realization now shaped everything. The HOA could threaten fines, but fines could be challenged. It could restrict access, but restrictions required consistency. It could send letters, but letters became evidence. Every tool the HOA used now carried risk, because residents were no longer absorbing pressure privately. They were converting it into documentation. As summer began to fade into early fall, the board's posture changed from assertive to cautious, and caution in an HOA reads like weakness because it reveals fear of accountability. The neighborhood felt the approach of an inevitable outcome, not through rumor, but through the shape of events. External boundaries had been defined, internal records had been collected, and the HOA's narrative had collapsed under observation. The only question left was whether the board would concede quietly by reforming itself, or whether it would commit one final overreach, one last attempt to punish and intimidate. That would force a decisive consequence too visible to contain, setting the stage for the final chapter where control would not be negotiated, but ended. The end did not arrive with a dramatic announcement or a public apology, because systems built on control rarely admit collapse in ways that feel satisfying in the moment. Instead, it arrived quietly, through revisions, resignations, and procedural shifts that acknowledged reality without ever naming it. The HOA's final attempt to maintain authority came not as escalation, but as retreat disguised as reform. Policies were rewritten and circulated with careful neutrality. Enforcement language softened and standardized, discretionary phrases removed as if they had never existed. Guest access rules for the pool were clarified, simplified, and applied uniformly, not because fairness had suddenly become a priority, but because inconsistency had become too expensive. The pool gate no longer felt like a checkpoint. It became what it was always supposed to be, an amenity rather than a tool. The board framed these changes as proactive improvements, part of an ongoing commitment to community harmony, but the neighborhood understood what they really were: concessions extracted through sustained attention rather than confrontation. The board member whose actions had triggered the chain of events did not make a public exit. There was no scandal, no forced removal, no spectacle. Her influence simply faded. She stopped attending meetings regularly. Her name appeared less frequently in communications. Eventually, it appeared only in archived minutes, then not at all. When her driveway returned to its usual pristine condition, it no longer symbolized dominance. It symbolized memory. Everyone remembered how easily water had rewritten the story concrete was supposed to tell. The HOA's budget shifted subtly as well, with legal consultation costs reduced and enforcement expenses normalized, signaling an internal acknowledgement that aggressive control had backfired. Residents noticed how quickly the tone changed once accountability became unavoidable. Letters that once threatened now informed. Deadlines that once intimidated now accommodated. The fear that had powered compliance for years evaporated, replaced by a cautious but undeniable confidence. People no longer flinched when HOA communications arrived. They read them, they understood them, and that understanding changed the balance permanently. The neighborhood did not become utopian. Rules still existed, disagreements still surfaced, and enforcement still occurred when genuinely necessary. But the difference lay in predictability and fairness. Authority was no longer personal, it was procedural. And procedure, when transparent, does not need intimidation to function. The pool filled again, not just with water, but with people who felt entitled to be there, not because they were favored, but because they belonged. The simple act of shared access carried more weight than any formal resolution ever could. The HOA never acknowledged the driveway incident publicly, but it lingered in collective memory as the moment the illusion cracked. It wasn't about flooding or revenge. It was about demonstrating that power, when misused, creates vulnerabilities it cannot control. Water had followed the law, gravity had followed physics, and authority had learned its limits without being challenged directly. The residents who had documented, requested, compared, and waited understood that the real victory wasn't punishment but transformation. They hadn't overthrown the HOA, they had forced it to become what it claimed to be. That outcome felt more durable than any dramatic confrontation would have. Life in the neighborhood resumed its rhythms, but with a subtle recalibration. People greeted each other more openly, not because conflict had bonded them emotionally, but because shared awareness had replaced isolation. The pool was no longer a battleground. The driveway was no longer a symbol of untouchability. The board was no longer a shadow authority operating through ambiguity. It was accountable, watched, and aware that every decision lived beyond the moment it was made. The waterline, both literal and metaphorical, had receded, leaving behind not damage but clarity. And clarity, once established, does not wash away easily. The neighborhood had learned something enduring. Control thrives in silence, but fairness survives attention. The story ended not with triumph or humiliation, but with a recalibrated equilibrium where power understood its boundaries and residents understood theirs. The pool reflected the sky again, undisturbed, ordinary, finally just water, while beneath the surface of the community, the lesson remained permanently etched, like a watermark only visible once you know where to look, reminding everyone that karma does not always arrive loudly, but when it does arrive legally, patiently, and inevitably, it reshapes everything it touches.